The wind cut through the Virginia countryside like a sharp blade, carrying frost across the bare tobacco fields. Snow had begun to fall in thin, silent sheets, covering the plantation in a deceptive blanket of purity. The Whitmore estate rose ahead, its white pillars gleaming in the weak light, candles flickering in every window. Inside, warmth and laughter poured from the manor, rich and steady, spilling into the halls like music. Outside, in the cramped quarters behind the main house, the world was a different color. Cold and hunger pressed down on the enslaved families huddled around smoldering embers, their thin wool blankets doing little to hold the winter at bay. 18-year-old Celia moved quietly through the kitchen, her bare feet brushing the cold stone floor. The air smelled of bread baking and spices, a comforting aroma that made the pang in her stomach sharper. She lifted a heavy pot of stew and balanced it carefully on the counter, avoiding the spots where the frost had seeped through cracks in the walls. Her mother, Sarah, stirred another pot with hands raw and cracked from the day's work. Her movements were precise, habitual, almost machine-like, yet her eyes betrayed exhaustion and a deep, unspoken sorrow. Celia watched her, memorizing every line of her face, every gesture. She had learned early to read these signs, to understand what words could not express. Through the frost-streaked windows, Celia could see the main house. The dining room was alive with golden light, the kind that seemed to hum with privilege. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight, reflecting tiny sparks like stars trapped in glass. Silk rustled as servants attended to the guests, while the family moved with an ease born of wealth, entirely removed from the suffering beyond their walls. The aroma of roasted goose and spiced ham drifted faintly through the air vents, teasing Celia's senses and reminding her of the empty pit in her stomach. She tightened her grip on the tray she carried, steadying herself against a wave of envy and rage she had long learned to contain. This was a rhythm she had known all her life. Christmas at the Whitmore estate was a time of abundance for the family and quiet endurance for those who labored unseen. Celia's mother had prepared the same meals the family would consume with laughter and ceremony, yet the cooks and house servants would eat only what remained, scraps and leftovers that had lost warmth before reaching them. Celia's own hunger was a constant companion, a gnawing ache she had learned to tolerate but never forget. Every year, she observed the family's feasts through windows fogged with frost, imagining the taste of a warm roll, a piece of honeyed ham, a pastry filled with jam. She closed her eyes and breathed in slowly, savoring the scent, a small, private rebellion against her reality. Master Edmund Whitmore moved through the room with the authority of a man accustomed to unquestioned obedience. His wife, Margaret, presided over the gathering with a delicate smile and gestures rehearsed over years of social performance. Their children, Edmund Jr., Catherine, and Thomas, ran along the edges of the dinner room, laughing and picking at their plates, oblivious to the world beyond the walls. Their innocence was a shield built on the labor and suffering of others, a bubble that no winter's wind could pierce. Celia had watched them grow, noting their first steps, their first words, their first experiences of frustration and joy, all while understanding that their comfort came at the cost of her own people's suffering. She glanced at the ledger that lay open on a small counter in the kitchen, pages filled with numbers that represented human lives, purchase prices, maintenance costs, expected output, and replacement value. Her name appeared there, not as a person, but as a figure among others, interchangeable, expendable. Celia had seen the way her mother's shoulders tensed when she read those pages, the quiet fury she kept hidden under careful control. "Bide your time," her mother had whispered countless nights, the words a thread of hope tangled in despair. Celia repeated them silently now, feeling the weight of years in that phrase. Time had been her enemy, stretching each season of toil and hunger into an endless measure of patience and submission. The snow outside deepened, muffling the distant sounds of the estate. Celia's eyes traced the flickering shadows on the walls, cast by candlelight dancing against pots and pans. The kitchen was her world and prison at once, a place where she moved with practiced care, ensuring nothing spilled, nothing broke, Nothing drew unwanted attention. She thought of the children in the quarters, curled beneath thin blankets, their breaths shallow and uneven. She thought of Marcus, her childhood friend, sold south to a cotton plantation, his absence a sharp ache that never dulled. Each memory pressed against her ribs, a reminder of the cruelty she had endured and the lives she had watched slip away. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine another life, one where the wind did not bite so sharply, where bellies were full and backs unscarred. She pictured fields of green, laughter untainted by fear, warmth shared freely among those she loved. The vision faded quickly, replaced by the cold reality of her own reflection in the steel pot she polished, face pale and eyes sharp. She was bound by circumstance, but her mind was free. Every action, every careful step, every silent observation was a record of endurance, a statement of presence. The evening wore on. The sounds of the main house grew louder, the clinking of glass and the hum of conversation filtering faintly into the kitchen. Celia moved among the hearths, tending to flames that could not warm her, feeding fires that did not belong to her. Yet she felt a strange solace in the heat, a connection to power that was not hers by right, but by proximity. It reminded her that even in small ways life pressed forward. Survival demanded attention, calculation, and the careful measuring of fear against opportunity. By midnight, the estate was alive with music and laughter, the family comfortably ensconced in warmth. Celia paused by the window, looking out over the snow-covered fields, the land stretching endlessly into darkness. Her reflection merged with the shadows of the kitchen, a ghost among the living. She clenched her hands, feeling the sting of cold against skin, the ache of hunger, and the weight of a mind that could not remain idle. Tonight, like every night, she carried the memory of injustice, the pulse of unspoken anger, and the slow burn of a decision yet to be made. In the distance, a candle flickered in the wind, fragile and determined. It reminded her of herself, small, overlooked, yet capable of illuminating even the darkest corners. Celia straightened, her shoulders set, eyes sharp. Winter had hardened the land, but it had also sharpened her senses. Every shadow, every whisper, every unguarded moment in the grand house was a lesson. The cold night pressed against her, but inside, a fire of another sort had begun to glow, slow and deliberate, waiting for the moment it would be fed. Tonight, the winter wind carried more than frost. It carried possibility, the faintest trace of change, and the weight of a mind no longer willing to remain invisible. Celia moved quietly through the corridors of the Whitmore estate, her bare feet pressing softly against polished wood, avoiding the creaks that could betray her presence. The house was alive with warmth and noise, yet it carried an undercurrent of coldness that could not be measured in degrees. In the study, she paused at the door, pretending to sweep, while listening to Master Edmund speak in measured tones with Jacob Mills. Words meant only for those in power floated lightly across the room, yet each one struck Celia like a hammer. "The winter stores are running low. We'll need to cut rations again," Mills said, his voice calm, almost matter-of-fact. Edmund's reply was casual, a shrug of authority. "Naturally. The accounts must be maintained. Reduce portions as necessary. The strong survive, the weak are a cost." She pressed her hand against the cool wood of the counter, the tiny burn from the candle she had carried earlier, reminding her of her own hunger, her own strength, her own helplessness. Each syllable from the study reverberated in her chest. The week would be called by winter's end. They were counting bodies like coins, assessing the value of life as if it were ledger entries. She had known this was how the world measured her existence. Yet hearing it aloud twisted her stomach into knots of rage and fear. In the quarters, old Samuel coughed violently, spitting blood onto the floor. Mary's youngest child shivered beneath the threadbare blanket that did nothing to keep the frost at bay. Celia imagined the cuts, bruises, and sores etched into her people's bodies. She remembered the smell of sweat, smoke, and sorrow that hung in the rooms where she had slept as a child, the nights where hunger gnawed like teeth at her insides. Each detail was a reminder of what the masters valued: comfort, profit, and control, above all else. She had seen it every year, in every season, and yet it never lost its sting. Her gaze drifted to the silverware stacked neatly on the counter, polished until it shone brighter than the eyes of the children in the cold quarters. The spoons, forks, and knives glimmered, catching the candlelight in a way that made the injustice of her world tangible. These were tools for pleasure and display, not for sustenance. The plates waiting for dessert were adorned with honey cakes and pastries, each one a symbol of excess. Every bite consumed by the Whitmore family was a reminder of the deprivation she and her people endured. The contrast burned more sharply than any flame. Celia remembered the stories of those who had resisted, whispered in the dark corners of the quarters. Marcus, struck down after challenging an overseer, sold south and lost to her forever. Sarah Chen, who had poisoned her master's food, burned in the town square for daring to reclaim her body and will. Rebellion, she had learned, carried death as its price. Yet still, the thought of fire, the thought of justice delivered quickly and without hesitation, lingered in the corners of her mind. She imagined the silk curtains catching flame, the mahogany furniture blackening, the ledgers and papers turning to ash. In her mind, the heat was not punishment. It was truth. The night deepened, and the feast in the main house continued. Edmund Jr. and Catherine ran through corridors, their laughter spilling over walls, a sound so bright it seemed to mock the darkness outside. Thomas, the youngest, complained of fullness, his small hands pressing against a distended belly, unaware that the fullness was not shared by those who had labored for his comfort. Celia watched them with an intensity that made her heart ache. She had seen them grow under the protection of wealth, untouched by hunger or cold, shielded from the world that had forged her every day. Their innocence was built on suffering, and each moment of ease they experienced weighed heavily upon her conscience. She moved toward the hearth, checking the fire, tending it without thought for herself. The room smelled of smoke, embers, and ash, a scent she associated with warmth and survival. Yet she knew it was false security. Beyond the walls, the wind whispered across the frozen fields, carrying the faint smell of the main house's candle wax, its roasted meats, and the lingering perfume of Margaret Whitmore. Celia closed her eyes, imagining the fire consuming everything that symbolized the family's control, erasing the sharp contrast between wealth and starvation, between comfort and deprivation. Her thoughts returned to the ledgers, open and vulnerable in the study. She had glimpsed them many times while performing her duties, each page a record of human life quantified for profit. Birth dates, purchase prices, expected service, replacement cost, numbers stacked neatly in columns, reducing flesh and blood to commodities. The accounts were meticulous, the calculations precise, the detachment total. She had stared at her own name, written beside tools and animals, and felt the bitter recognition of her place in a world that valued her only for labor. That recognition now fed a quiet, simmering fire inside her. The snow thickened outside, falling silently onto the fields, a serene mask over the harsh reality. Celia's shadow stretched across the kitchen floor, blending with the dark corners where she had slept, hidden, and endured. The hours of toil, the constant vigilance, the careful movements to avoid notice, all these had sharpened her mind, strengthened her resolve. She understood the rhythm of the house, the habits of its occupants, the unspoken hierarchies that guided every action. Each moment of observation was a note in a symphony of preparation, a rehearsal for a reckoning that had not yet begun but was already inevitable. As midnight approached, the warmth of the main house felt heavier, almost oppressive. The laughter, the music, the clinking of glasses, it was all a reminder of what had been stolen, what had been denied, and what had been ignored. Celia's stomach clenched, but the hunger she felt was not only physical. It was the need for recognition, for justice, for a measure of agency in a world that had refused her any. She clenched her fists, the raw edges of her palms pressing into her skin, grounding herself in the reality she had long endured. The candle she had carried earlier still flickered on the counter, its small flame a whisper of possibility. The wind outside carried no sound of it, yet inside the kitchen it seemed to pulse, waiting, patient, and relentless. Celia straightened, drawing a slow, deliberate breath. She was part of the shadows, part of the cold, part of the unseen labor that held the Whitmore world together. But she was also aware sharply that time had limits, that patience had its edges. Each act of cruelty, each casual dismissal of suffering, had carved a line through her mind, marking the moment when observation could turn into action. The night stretched before her, white and quiet, yet charged with potential. And in the stillness beneath the weight of injustice, Celia felt the first flicker of something powerful, something that would not wait any longer. The house slept under its own warmth, oblivious to the world beyond its walls. Celia lingered in the kitchen, the smell of roasted meats and sugar still clinging to the air. The silver trays she had carried that evening reflected flickers of candlelight, sharp as the thoughts in her mind. She moved with the silence of someone who had practiced disappearing into shadows, a skill honed over 18 years of careful observation. Each step was deliberate, each motion measured, as though the very floor beneath her held memory of the countless hands that had walked it before. The house belonged to them, yet she had spent years learning its heartbeat, its vulnerabilities, its secrets. She paused by the stairwell leading to the upper floors. The polished mahogany gleamed under the faint candlelight, a symbol of wealth and power built on suffering. Her eyes traced the contours of the wood, the carvings that celebrated a history she had never been allowed to touch, never been allowed to claim. The laughter of the family upstairs, carried faintly through the walls, prickled her skin like static. Every note, every giggle, every careless word was a reminder of the distance between their world and hers. She had long internalized the rules: observe, endure, remain invisible. But tonight, the rules seemed brittle, easily shattered by the weight of anger and clarity that pressed in from every direction. Celia thought of the ledgers again, the open pages that recorded human lives as if they were cattle or tools. Purchase price, expected years of service, replacement value. Her own name had stared back at her countless times, a small, cold imprint among figures that meant nothing in warmth, love, or pain. She could see her mother, shoulders hunched over the fire, stirring a pot with hands raw and aching. Every line, every crack, every bruise her mother bore was a testament to the system that had demanded submission and rewarded compliance with suffering. Celia clenched her fists, the weight of inherited injustice settling in her chest like a stone. Outside, the snow fell heavier, muffling the distant sounds of the estate. The world seemed paused, expectant, waiting. Celia moved toward the study, her steps soundless, carrying the candle she had lit hours ago. Its flame danced in the shadowed hallway, casting shapes that seemed alive, twisting on the walls, reaching toward the ceiling. Each flicker was a pulse, a heartbeat of intention that mirrored her own. The air was cold, yet the fire she carried in her hands was warmer than any hearth, heavier than any thought of submission. She felt the gravity of choice, the weight of years condensed into a single moment that demanded resolution. Her mind drifted to Marcus, sold south and gone from her world forever. She remembered the hollow feeling in her chest when she had heard of his departure, the knowledge that her own survival had done nothing to save him. She thought of little Samuel, coughing in the quarters, his small body racked by illness and neglect. Each loss, each deprivation, each stolen moment pressed down on her, sharpening her focus, guiding her hand. She could no longer live as if her observation was neutral, as if endurance alone were justice. Action, decisive and irrevocable, was the only path that remained. The wind whispered against the outer walls, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and frost, a calm that belied the turmoil inside. Celia paused at the doorway to the main hall, studying the arrangement of furniture, the positioning of rugs, the proximity of the windows to the hearths. Every detail was a map, a guide to leverage power in a space that had never allowed her any. She considered the silk curtains, imported and heavy, their threads golden and proud, their touch soft enough to remember on her fingers. Each object represented an opportunity, a channel through which she could transform her rage into form, her grief into motion. Upstairs, the family slept, unaware of the calculation being made beneath them. Edmund Jr. lay in a bed too large for his small frame. Catherine's hand rested on the edge of her pillow, and Thomas, the youngest, drew shallow breaths as his body absorbed warmth that was foreign to so many others. Margaret and Edmund moved in dreams that had never known fear, privilege as a shield, comfort as inheritance. Their innocence was born of protection, yet it was built on the denial of humanity to those who served them. Celia's gaze lingered on the portrait above the staircase, a painted reminder of generations who had built their comfort on labor and suffering, the faces immortalized in oil, staring down with calm detachment. Her fingers brushed the candle flame, and she felt its heat as if it had been waiting for her, a small, steady reminder of possibility. The fire was a companion, patient, unyielding, a force that required only intention to transform the quiet of the night. Celia's breath came slow, her mind cataloging each detail, each hazard, each step that would carry her from observation to action. She understood that this night would not be like any other. The world she had inhabited for 18 years, bounded by cold floors and silent obedience, was about to fracture. Every moment since birth had prepared her for this. Every act of endurance had honed her ability to perceive weakness, to recognize the pivot points of control, to anticipate movement and consequence. Celia's resolve hardened. The silence of the night pressed against her ears, the muted glow of candles reflecting off polished surfaces, the faint sound of distant wind through the trees. It all seemed to amplify her own heartbeat. The decision that had long simmered beneath careful compliance rose to the surface, sharp and undeniable. She was no longer merely a witness to cruelty, no longer a participant in the quiet endurance of injustice. She had seen enough, suffered enough, measured enough. The fire she carried was not a threat, not a punishment. It was an articulation of truth, a reckoning that the walls of the house and the wealth of its occupants could no longer suppress. Her shadow stretched long across the floor, merging with the darkness of the hall. Becoming something larger, more deliberate, she could see the contours of the grand staircase, the lines of the study, the edges of the rooms she had cleaned countless times, each now alive with new potential. Tonight, the careful observation, the silent endurance, and the sharp attention to detail would converge into a single act, and for the first time, Celia felt not fear, but clarity. The decision was no longer about survival in the way she had understood it, but about the transformation of power itself, about claiming agency in a world that had denied her every choice. The candle's flame reflected in her eyes, small and trembling yet unbroken. She drew in a deep, steadying breath and stepped toward the study, toward the ledgers, toward the heart of what had always been beyond her reach. The house hummed softly around her, the warmth of indulgence above and the cold of labor below, oblivious to the calculation of one young woman who had endured its every injustice. Celia moved like a shadow given life, silent, deliberate, aware of every sound, every flicker of light, every heartbeat. Tonight, nothing would be the same. Celia's hand trembled slightly as she approached the study, the candle flame casting long, wavering shadows across the polished floors. She could hear her own heartbeat, slow but insistent, a drum marking the rhythm of something inevitable. The room smelled of ink, parchment, and the faint trace of tobacco. Ledgers lay open on the massive mahogany desk, each page filled with numbers that translated human lives into profit. She traced the edge of the papers with her fingers, imagining the weight of years reduced to columns and sums. For a moment, the world outside the study fell away, leaving only the knowledge of what had been done and what must now be done. The silence in the house was deceptive. Upstairs, the Whitmores slept in their inherited warmth, unaware of the reckoning approaching. Below, the enslaved quarters remained dark, except for the occasional candle flicker, small and protective, casting brief shadows across tired faces. Celia's mother, Sarah, had fallen into fitful sleep, exhausted from the endless labor. Yet her presence lingered, a constant reminder of survival, resilience, and suffering. Celia inhaled, drawing in the scent of wax and wood, and felt the first surge of resolve. The candle trembled slightly in her grasp, but the warmth it provided felt like more than light. It was possibility made tangible. She set the flame to the edge of the ledger, the paper crackling immediately. Smoke rose, curling in delicate spirals, carrying with it the history of domination, cruelty, and indifference. Numbers turned to ash before her eyes, a transformation that felt almost sacred. The fire leapt quickly, hungry and deliberate, licking the edges of the desk and consuming correspondence detailing the acquisition, trade, and management of enslaved lives. Each page burned as if it were conscious, each line of ink evaporating into heat and light. Celia stepped back, heart pounding, watching as the record of oppression disintegrated. The warmth of the fire spread through the study, curling into the corners of the room and climbing the walls. The scent of burning paper mixed with the faint tang of polished wood, creating an aroma both terrifying and intoxicating. Celia's mind raced, cataloging the paths of destruction she could take next. The silk curtains would ignite quickly, and from there, the fire could claim the floors, the furniture, the rooms that symbolized centuries of wealth built on stolen labor. She imagined the shock in the eyes of Edmund, Margaret, and the children when the flames reached the upper floors. The sudden realization that comfort and privilege offered no protection against elemental justice. Celia's attention returned to the ledgers for a brief moment. The names of her people, listed as property, had vanished in smoke and heat. There was a strange satisfaction in watching their erasure, a reclaiming of identity in the only way she could assert. Numbers were powerless against fire. Records could not survive it, and the truth hidden behind ink and paper could finally emerge. She pressed the candle to more pages, each one burning faster than she expected, feeding the hunger of the flames. The heat began to press against her skin, yet she did not move. She was no longer merely observer. She had become an agent, a force shaping the environment in response to a lifetime of subjugation. Footsteps above made her pause. The house seemed to shiver in anticipation, the boards beneath her responding with faint creaks. Celia froze, listening. It was the movement of Edmund, likely checking the study as part of his routine before returning to sleep. He had never understood the full extent of the world outside his comfort, and tonight, the house itself would reveal the limits of his power. The thought steeled her resolve. There would be no warning, no chance to plead, no way to negotiate the destruction that had already begun in her mind. Justice had its own timing, its own measure, its own voice. Smoke began to curl along the ceiling, rising with a slow insistence that matched the rhythm of her pulse. Celia could feel it gathering, thickening, a visible manifestation of the choice she had made. The room was no longer just a study. It was a crucible. Every wall, every bookcase, every piece of furniture was a reminder of the hierarchy she had endured, the labor she had performed, and the control that had been imposed upon her body and mind. The fire consumed all of it indiscriminately, transforming symbols of cruelty into symbols of inevitability. She moved toward the curtains, fingertips grazing the soft threads as she imagined the explosion of flame that would follow. The silk, imported and luxurious, had always represented a world beyond her reach. Its destruction would be swift, the fire racing along its fibers, igniting the room with urgency and purpose. Celia's lips pressed together, the smallest line of tension marking the threshold between hesitation and action. She had carried this moment in her mind for months, rehearsed it silently with precision, and now it was no longer rehearsal, it was execution. Celia set the candle to the hem of the curtain, and the flame caught immediately. She watched, entranced, as it climbed upward, the threads curling into itself, glowing orange before vanishing into smoke. Heat rushed toward her, prickling her skin, wrapping her senses in the intensity of creation and destruction merged. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls closing in with the pulse of the fire, yet she stood rooted, every breath deliberate, every heartbeat a drum of certainty. She could feel the building tension in the house, the unspoken understanding that something irreversible had begun. From the kitchen, the faint sounds of shuffling footsteps suggested the household staff had not yet fully grasped what was happening. Celia knew she could not stop now. Her gaze swept the study, taking in the mahogany desk, the bookshelves, and the scattered correspondence, all now feeding the small, unstoppable blaze. The fire would grow, and with it, the story of retaliation, the reckoning for years of pain and deprivation, would claim space and voice in the world above and below the floors she had walked so many times unnoticed. The flame, once small and tentative, was now a promise of inevitability, a declaration that the world she had endured was not eternal, and justice, however long delayed, had arrived in its purest form. Flames licked hungrily at the curtains, curling around the edges of the grand windows with a sudden ferocity that startled even Celia. The study, once orderly and precise, now smelled of scorched paper, melted wax, and the bitter tang of polished wood meeting fire. Smoke rose in thick, twisting columns, filling the corners of the room and curling into the hallways beyond. Celia felt the heat on her skin, a pressure that demanded respect, yet she did not retreat. She had carried the memory of years of starvation, of silent suffering, of indignities measured in glances and whispers, and none of it could compare to the clarity she now felt standing amidst the first pulse of destruction. From the upper floors, soft creaks and groans suggested that the house was responding to its new master, fire. The structure had held for decades, proud in its architecture, flawless in its display of wealth and power. Tonight, it acknowledged no hierarchy, no legacy, only the force moving through it with quiet inevitability. Celia moved carefully, avoiding fallen embers, aware that every floorboard could buckle, every shadow could conceal a sudden collapse. Yet her focus was singular: to see through this act, to witness the transformation of what had been a cage into something alive with judgment. She thought of the children, their laughter and cries always echoing in her mind, reminders of the world that had been built for them on the backs of others. The irony was not lost. The very comfort that had protected them from want now offered no shield against the elements she commanded. She imagined their awakening, the confusion, the terror, the realization that wealth and privilege could not oppose fire, could not postpone consequences, could not bargain with inevitability. Every second that passed tightened the grip of inevitability around the estate, each flicker of flame a statement that the world they had known was no longer theirs. The fire consumed quickly, leaping from desk to bookshelf, from paper to mahogany, igniting the small trophies and ornaments that littered the room. Candles set in silver holders melted, spilling wax onto the floor, feeding the blaze further. Celia watched, entranced by the methodical speed, the precision of destruction. Nothing screamed, nothing pleaded. The house itself seemed to hum in response to her decision, as though every board, every pane of glass, every piece of polished wood understood the reckoning it had long awaited. From somewhere above, a faint sound, a door creaking, a floorboard bending, reminded her that the inhabitants of the house were still ignorant of their impending confrontation. She could imagine Edmund rising, bewildered, calling for Margaret, the children rubbing sleep from their eyes, their innocence colliding with a reality that had always been hidden behind walls of comfort. Celia felt neither vengeance nor malice. The fire was impartial, just as she imagined justice itself should be. It did not discriminate between age or refinement. It did not pause for innocence or fear. It only burned, converting years of oppression into immediate consequence. Outside, the night was still, the snow falling softly, muted against the sudden brightness from within. The enslaved quarters remained in shadow, yet many had stirred, drawn by the strange glow and scent carried on the winter air. Some approached cautiously, others simply watched, frozen in disbelief, trying to reconcile the girl they had known with the force that now dominated the house. There was awe, yes, but also fear, a recognition that power, once denied, could manifest in ways uncontrollable and terrifying. Celia's figure moved like a shadow among shadows, careful, deliberate, immune to the panic that had begun to ripple through the upper floors. Smoke thickened, curling into the hallways, searing eyes and lungs, yet she pressed on. The house had become a living entity, reacting to its own destruction, groaning as beams shifted, shattering glass scattering across polished floors. The chandelier trembled, suspended by only a few strained links, threatening to collapse into the room below. The fire's appetite grew, its force spreading to the adjoining rooms, consuming the ornate rugs and imported fabrics that had once represented taste, wealth, and social rank. Every crackling sound and every curling plume of smoke felt deliberate, as if the house itself acknowledged its complicity in a system built on stolen lives. Celia's hands moved with precision. She shifted the candle, touching edges of furniture, fabrics, anything that could carry the fire forward, ensuring that the path she had chosen would be complete. Her eyes reflected the blaze, twin pools of intensity and resolve. Every room she passed became a stage on which justice was performed, each action deliberate, exact, and irreversible. She paused for a moment, looking at a window pane, remembering the countless times she had cleaned glass while the family dined, while her stomach ached in hunger. Now that same glass framed the light of retribution, a lens through which the inequities of years burned brightly for all to see. The fire moved with a life of its own, yet it was Celia's guidance that had given it direction. She imagined the family, caught in warm beds, suddenly confronted with the reality that walls and luxury could not protect them. She imagined Margaret screaming, trying to rouse her children, Edmund attempting to save what he had always valued above humanity itself. She imagined their panic, their desperation, and yet she felt no glee. What burned before her was not a game, not revenge for amusement, but the embodiment of centuries of neglect, cruelty, and indifference transformed into undeniable consequence. Time stretched, measured in the roar of flames, the snapping of beams, and the hiss of melting wax. Celia moved from the study into the hall, leading the fire with careful touches, a conductor orchestrating the symphony of destruction. Every room became a testament to what power without accountability could never withstand. The luxury, the wealth, the objects that had marked the family as untouchable, all were now fuel for truth, clarity, and reckoning. Celia paused at the top of the grand staircase, observing the spread of fire through the first floor below. Smoke billowed upward, carrying heat and sound with it, a physical manifestation of her resolve. The house was awake now, no longer a silent monument to cruelty, but an active participant in its own collapse. Every flicker of flame, every snap of timber, every whisper of smoke was a reminder that action, once taken, could not be undone. She took a deep breath, feeling the fire's warmth and the cold night air pressing against her skin, and she knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The flames had grown insistent now, stretching into the hallways and climbing the walls with a relentless hunger. Celia felt the heat pressing against her, a living weight that demanded acknowledgement. Every inhale carried the sharp scent of smoke and charred wood, filling her lungs with the taste of inevitability. She moved with a careful rhythm, aware that each step could crumble beneath her, yet compelled forward by the certainty that she could not stop. The house was no longer a building. It had become a force, a mirror of the pain it had concealed for generations. From the upper floors came the first human sound, a startled cry, muffled by smoke but unmistakable in its urgency. It pierced the roar of fire, a fragile thread of fear and confusion. Celia's chest tightened, but she did not falter. She had anticipated this moment, had rehearsed it in her mind through countless nights of silent anger and whispered dreams of justice. The fire did not pause for their voices. It did not bend to their cries. It obeyed the singular law of natural consequence, sweeping through hall and study, consuming the artifacts of wealth with indifferent purpose. She watched the chandelier sway, suspended like a pendulum over polished floors now fractured by heat. Sparks fell, scattering across rugs that had once been admired for their foreign patterns and soft threads. The imported wood of the banisters glowed, revealing veins of flame racing along them as if the house itself had begun to pulse with life. Celia traced her steps carefully, guiding the fire toward corridors, rooms, and closets filled with the symbols of indulgence she had long envied from afar. Every ignited object carried a message. Luxury could not hide cruelty, comfort could not shield from accountability. Above, footsteps and shouts began to echo, faint and disoriented through the smoke. Edmund's voice, usually commanding and cold, now trembled with confusion and fear. Margaret's scream joined it, a high, frantic sound that pierced the heavy air. Celia could hear the children coughing, crying, their small lungs struggling for air. The realization dawning that the world they had always known was dissolving into chaos. Yet her hand remained steady, her eyes unblinking, guiding the candle along the edges of furniture, the corners of rugs, the folds of drapery. Each spark she touched carried intention. Each flame became a word in the language of retribution she had long learned in silence. The fire spread methodically, leaping from one surface to the next with precise appetite. Mahogany tables, polished to perfection, ignited under the kiss of heat, the lacquered surfaces bubbling and cracking. Books fell into blackened piles, pages curling and disintegrating in the smoke that filled every corner. The Persian carpets, woven with patience and wealth, smoldered and ignited, releasing the scent of dyes and long-forgotten fibers. Each burst of flame illuminated a reality that had been hidden behind grandeur and polite conversation. The estate had thrived on suffering, and now it was paying its due. Celia moved down the hallway toward the bedrooms, the fire trailing behind her like a shadow. The heat pressed closer, thickening the smoke that made every breath a labor. She inhaled deliberately, tasting ash and soot, feeling her resolve sharpen with each moment. In the distance, she heard the desperate pounding of hands on doors, the frantic attempts of the family to secure their safety. Yet there were no doors left unchallenged by the flames, no locks that could hold back what had already been set in motion. Each barrier the family tried to use to protect themselves became a stage for the fire's assertive spread, proving that no privilege could delay reckoning. The children's cries were sharp now, cutting through the roar of fire and the groan of collapsing timbers. Celia paused briefly, the sound striking something deep within her, a reminder of the fragile humanity she could not ignore entirely. She remembered her own childhood, the hunger and cold, the small mercies of warmth or shared bread. Yet even as her chest tightened, she reminded herself of the balance she sought. Not cruelty for pleasure, but justice for the systematic theft of lives, for years of silent suffering that had left her with nothing but a name and memory. From the staircase came the sudden crash of a beam giving way. Sparks and embers showered the hallway as the floor below trembled. Celia stepped carefully back, feeling the instability beneath her, yet she remained in the hallway, observing the spread of flames, understanding the scale of what she had set in motion. Each room she passed carried echoes of life once lived in comfort and entitlement, now transformed into ash and heat, a tangible testament to the imbalance that had long been ignored. The study, once a place of quiet control, now blazed with fury, the accounts and records of enslaved lives turning to smoke and ash. Celia watched the flames consume the documents, the papers curled into themselves, blackened and distorted, leaving nothing but the smell of burned history. Each ledger represented planning, calculation, and disregard, and the fire erased it with merciless efficiency. The heat rose, filling the corridor and pressing against her chest, a tangible reminder of the power she had harnessed. Outside, the enslaved watched from a distance. Their breaths held, eyes wide with awe, fear, and disbelief. Some whispered prayers, others cursed under their breaths, and a few dared not speak at all. They could see the glow, the smoke, and hear the roar, yet comprehension of the full extent was impossible until the morning light. Celia's figure remained framed by the flames, small and singular, a conductor of consequence in a world that had long denied her agency. The house awakened, groaned and crackled as the fire consumed its foundations. Walls began to bend under heat, ceilings threatened collapse, and glass shattered under the intensity. Smoke and flame enveloped every surface, leaving nothing untouched. Celia breathed in the acrid air, feeling her skin prickling, her lungs burning, yet she remained steady, her gaze fixed on the path she had begun. Each room, each item, each shadow was now part of a story she had written in fire. One of justice, one of reckoning, one of undeniable consequence. The heat pressed against Celia from every side, a tangible force that seemed to push her forward while threatening to crush her under its weight. Smoke curled into every corner of the house, filling her eyes and throat, yet she moved without hesitation. Each step she took was measured, deliberate, a continuation of the act she had begun hours ago. Below her, the fire gnawed at the floorboards, the walls, the furniture, consuming everything that had represented privilege and power. This was no longer a house. It was a testament to years of exploitation, a monument to cruelty reduced to flame. From somewhere above, a faint cry cut through the roar, sharp and urgent. The children, Edmund Jr., Catherine, and little Thomas, were calling for their parents, their voices small but full of terror. Celia felt the sting of recognition, a reminder of what life had denied her: family, protection, safety. Yet she reminded herself that justice was not vengeance against innocence, but the reckoning of those who had built their comfort atop suffering. The house trembled as the fire climbed higher, beams cracking, ceilings sagging, glass shattering with sudden explosions that sent shards like stars scattering across the floor. Edmund Whitmore struggled with the window again. Frantic, his hands blistered, his silk nightshirt singed and wet with sweat. Margaret screamed, clinging to her children, dragging them toward the nearest exit, only to find that the corridors she had walked for decades were now mazes of flame and smoke. The staircases had begun to buckle, each step threatening collapse under weight and heat. The very structure they had trusted to preserve their lives now conspired against them, indifferent to cries, wealth, or bloodline. Celia moved silently, her presence in the hallway like a shadow cast by the fire itself, guiding its fury without interference, a witness to every act of fear and despair. The chandelier wavered dangerously, crystal prisms scattering light that danced across curling smoke. Celia paused briefly to watch it sway, the reflections of flame multiplying, fracturing into colors she had never seen outside this inferno. The house seemed to pulse in rhythm with the fire, groaning and snapping as if acknowledging the inevitability of its own destruction. In the parlor, the furniture ignited fully, fire devouring silk and wood, leather and lace. Every object once admired, every treasure once hoarded, now succumbed to the same impartial law of flame. The wealth that had defined lives, separated people, and dictated hierarchies was nothing more than ash and heat. Outside, the enslaved watched from the edge of the fields, snow crunching beneath their feet. Their eyes followed the fire's spread, hearts caught between fear and fascination. They whispered among themselves, debating whether intervention was possible, whether a life spared would honor the girl who had risked everything. Some, led by Sarah, moved cautiously toward the inferno with buckets of water, their motions hesitant, constrained by the weight of history and the immediacy of danger. Others stood still, unable to act, caught in the strangeness of watching the powerless claim power in a way they had long imagined, but never dared attempt. The children's cries grew fainter as smoke thickened around their hiding place near a broken window. Edmund's voice cracked, calling for Margaret, calling for reason, for escape, for any strategy to undo what had begun. Margaret clutched Thomas to her chest, her body shaking, her hair streaked with soot, her hands slipping on scorched silk. They were trapped in a theater of consequences, the stage of their lives collapsing under the weight of the fire they had never imagined could reach them. Celia watched, detached yet intensely aware, understanding the scale of what had been set in motion. Each scream, each coughing fit, each desperate attempt to survive was a verse in the story she had written with her own hands. The staircase gave way beneath a massive beam, sending a shower of sparks cascading into the hallway. Celia jumped back, steadying herself against the wall, heart pounding not with fear, but with the awareness that she had become part of something larger than herself. The fire moved with precision now, guided by her presence but alive with its own purpose. Walls blackened and bowed, ceilings split and fell, sending embers raining down like a storm. The house, once a temple to wealth and social dominance, was dying, and its death was magnificent in its clarity and inevitability. From the study, Celia could see the remnants of the upper floor collapse. Smoke and flame consumed every detail, obscuring furniture, portraits, and ornaments that had once defined status. The wealth that had insulated the family from reality now offered no protection. Every wall, every beam, every object had become a participant in its own judgment. She thought of the ledger books, of the cold calculations of human lives reduced to numbers, of the casual cruelty recorded in ink. Those records were gone, devoured by fire before the family even grasped the full scale of their own peril. Celia paused for a brief moment, feeling the heat licking at her skin, the smoke thickening to the point of suffocation. She allowed herself a single breath of reflection, remembering Marcus, her mother, the children of the quarters, all of the small, overlooked lives that had suffered silently for decades. This act, terrible in its immediacy, was their voice, their justice, their reckoning. And yet, she also knew the weight of survival, the reality that the world outside the flames would remember her, would whisper her name, would debate the morality of what had been done. It did not matter. Action had consequences, and tonight the fire was the embodiment of truth. The family's cries diminished as smoke and heat took hold, the once grand rooms collapsing into themselves, consumed from floor to ceiling. Edmund made one last attempt at a window, hands blistered and trembling, only to realize the fall below would be fatal. Margaret pressed her children to her chest, rocking, whispering prayers that went unheard. Catherine tried to shield herself, her innocence unable to contend with the enormity of fire. Celia remained in the hallway, watching the final stages, feeling the pulse of destruction around her. Aware that the house was no longer a building, the family no longer a presence apart from the consequences they had ignored. The roof sagged, beams snapped, walls cracked, and floors gave way in sudden dramatic collapse. Fire and gravity combined to erase the grandeur that had seemed eternal. Celia's eyes reflected the inferno, twin flames of understanding and resolve. She had ignited more than a house. She had ignited history, accountability, and the undeniable truth that comfort built on cruelty could never stand unchallenged. Dawn crept across the Virginia fields, timid light brushing over the blackened skeleton of the Whitmore mansion. Smoke still rose in lazy spirals, carrying the bitter scent of charred wood, melted metal, and lost opulence. The fire that had raged through the night had left nothing untouched. The house had been a fortress of cruelty, built to shield wealth and entitlement, and now it was reduced to ash, a monument to the consequences long ignored. Celia stood among the ruins, her body scorched, her lungs raw, yet her spirit felt a strange clarity. She was no longer a shadow in the corners of a world that had denied her voice. She had acted. She had spoken in flames. The snow beneath her feet was streaked with soot and embers, a stark reminder of the night's violence. Around her, the enslaved community gathered cautiously, some approaching the ruins with buckets of water, others lingering at the edges, hearts heavy with awe, fear, and a tentative sense of liberation. Sarah stood closest, her face streaked with tears, soot, and the weight of survival. Her hands shook as she called to Celia, the words trembling on her lips. "Child, are you safe?" But Celia's eyes, reflecting the fire's memory, met her mother's without hesitation. Safety had never been the measure of her victory. Justice had been. Voices began to rise among the watchers, tentative conversations of disbelief, relief, and questions of what would come next. The fire had erased the house, yet it had also disrupted a hierarchy that had seemed eternal. Jacob Mills, the overseer who had planned punishment and ration cuts alongside Master Edmund, stood silently, the weight of complicity heavy upon him. Others, long accustomed to obedience, realized that the rules they had lived by had been overturned in a single night. Celia's actions had written a new story, one of consequence, of retribution. and of the possibility that power belonged not only to those who claimed it by law or title, but also to those who had long been denied recognition. The children of the Whitmore family, miraculously alive but coughing and weak, emerged from the ruins, their innocence fractured by smoke, fire, and terror. Catherine's wide eyes reflected the horror she could never unsee. Edmund Jr.'s small frame carried the weight of bewilderment and fear, and little Thomas, pale and trembling, clung to whatever remnants of family he could grasp. They had been protected by wealth all their lives, yet it offered no defense against the equalizing force of flames. In this moment, the disparity between life and death, between privilege and pain, was made plain. Celia observed quietly, aware of the paradox she had created. Life remained, yet the structures of cruelty had crumbled. The ruins crackled occasionally as hidden embers flared and died. Celia moved among the remnants, feeling the heat on her skin, the sharp scent of destruction in her nose. She traced her hands over blackened beams and twisted metal, imagining the years of pain encoded into every surface. This was her message, written in fire. No accumulation of wealth, no social rank, no polished veneer of civility could erase the suffering endured by those deemed invisible. She had witnessed it, she had felt it, and now she had delivered judgment. The fire had done what voices, petitions, and silent endurance could not. The enslaved watched her, their emotions tangled and complex. Some felt joy at the destruction of their oppressors' symbols, others sorrow for the violence of the act, and a few felt a flicker of fear, aware of the cost that had been paid in courage and heat. Sarah approached her daughter, hands reaching out, trembling. Celia met her touch, feeling the warmth of her mother's skin against the cold aftermath. Words were unnecessary. Understanding passed silently between them. The act had been perilous, necessary, and complete. The fire had changed more than bricks and timber. It had altered the consciousness of those who had witnessed it. In the distance, the land stretched wide and cold, the tobacco fields blanketed in snow, indifferent to the night's destruction. Birds called hesitantly, breaking the quiet with tentative song. Celia allowed herself a single deep breath, tasting the crisp air mixed with ash, a reminder that survival was possible even after destruction. The house was gone, the Whitmore legacy reduced to fragments, yet life endured. She looked to the community gathered nearby and saw not only fear but possibility, the sense that tomorrow could be different because today had been claimed by courage and choice. Memories of the night returned in fragments, the heat, the smoke, the sound of collapsing beams, the voices calling and fading, the weight of years pressed into a single decisive act. Celia felt it all, but there was no regret. The world she had known had been defined by denial and suffering. This act had been a reclamation, a statement that she and those like her could act in the face of injustice. The night had been merciless yet necessary, and in its wake lay the raw potential of freedom. Sarah drew her daughter close, the small figure of Celia resting against the larger protective frame of her mother. The snow fell silently around them, covering the blackened earth, softening the edges of the world they had inherited. For a moment, the fire seemed distant, a ghost of memory rather than a present threat. Celia felt the weight of her people's gaze upon her, the unspoken questions of what now, of how to live in the space carved free by flames. And yet, for the first time, she felt the quiet pulse of choice, of agency, of ownership over her own life. The chimney stood alone against the morning sky, a stark monument to the night's reckoning. Around it lay the ash and fragments of a world once ordered by cruelty and entitlement. The fire had been swift and absolute, leaving no room for denial or reinterpretation. Celia stood, arms raised slightly, chest heaving with exertion and relief, eyes scanning the horizon. The embers of the Whitmore estate glowed faintly in the snow, a testament not only to destruction but to endurance. Something new had begun, and the echoes of that night would linger in memory and story for generations to come. With the first clear light of dawn, Celia stepped forward, away from the ruins, her bare feet pressing into cold, forgiving snow. She carried the weight of action, the knowledge of consequences, and the quiet satisfaction that justice, however delayed or incomplete, had finally been served. Around her, the community began to stir, moving through the snow and ash, beginning the slow process of reckoning, rebuilding, and claiming the future that had been denied for so long. In that moment, freedom was not an abstract dream, but a lived reality, hard-won, and carried forward in the strength and courage of those who had refused to remain silent.